So today we're diving into a case that did so much more than just change a law. It completely redefined what a safe workplace even means for women in India. We're talking about the story of Vishaka versus the state of Rajasthan, a single moment of terrible injustice that, believe it or not, sparked a full-blown legal revolution.
Let's just start with this. The day a woman can walk freely on the roads at night, that day we can say that India has achieved independence. That's from Mahatma Gandhi. And it really sets the stage, right? It connects this huge idea of national freedom to something very personal, a woman's safety. And that's a standard that, decades down the line, was about to be tested in a way nobody saw coming.
And it all starts back in 1992. One woman's story, her fight, didn't just stir up trouble in her village. It ripped open this massive hole in India's legal system. It brought a huge, pervasive problem out into the open, a problem that, at the time, literally had no name in the law books. Sexual harassment at work.
All right, Section 1, the spark. This is where it all begins. We're going to talk about a social worker and the absolutely unimaginable price she paid just for doing her job.
So, meet Banwari Devi. She wasn't some high-powered lawyer or activist. She was a grassroots social worker, a sathin, which means a friend to her community. She worked for the government's Women's Development Program out in rural Rajasthan. And her job? Well, it was to take on these deeply rooted social problems, especially the practice of child marriage.
So in 1992, Banwari Devi did what she was supposed to do. She stepped in to stop the marriage of an infant girl, a baby from a very powerful higher caste family. And the pushback? It was fast and it was brutal. First, the village completely boycotted her and her family. But it got so much worse. As a horrifying act of revenge, several men from that family gang raped her right in front of her husband. And what happened next is just as shocking. The entire system that should have protected her just collapsed. The police, the doctors, the local authorities, they dismissed her. They didn't believe her. Her case just fell apart. And then, the final insult, the trial court let her attackers walk free. Acquitted. Okay, moving into Section 2, a glaring legal void. That verdict, it sent shockwaves across the entire country. This wasn't just Banwari Devi's personal tragedy anymore. It became the spark for a national movement. Because when she tried to find justice, she found out something terrifying. Legally speaking, there was nowhere for her to go. This outrage forced activists and women's groups to ask a really simple but profound question. Think about it. What legal protection did a woman like Banwari Devi, a government employee, actually have? If this happened to you at your job, what could you do? What did the law say? And the answer was just stunningly simple. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. There wasn't a law. There wasn't even a legal definition for it. No specific way for a woman to get help if she was being sexually harassed at her job. It was a total black hole in the law.
So what do you do when the system fails so completely? Well, in response to this massive injustice, a bunch of women's groups and NGOs, they all banded together. They took up Banwari Devi's fight and they went straight to the top. They filed what's called a public interest litigation directly with the Supreme Court of India. And they filed it under the collective name Vishaka. This wasn't just for one woman anymore. This was for every working woman in the country.
And that brings us to Section 3, the Supreme Court intervenes. Because, with no actual law to point to, these groups went to the highest court in the land. And their argument was powerful. They said, look, this isn't just a missing law. This is a fundamental crisis of human rights.
And their legal strategy here was absolutely brilliant. They argued that sexual harassment at work isn't some separate, isolated issue. No, it's a direct attack on the most basic, most fundamental rights guaranteed by the Indian Constitution. We're talking the right to equality, the rule against discrimination based on sex, the freedom to do your job, and maybe most important of all, the fundamental right to life and dignity. And the Supreme Court completely agreed. The judges basically said, what good is a right to work if you're not safe while you're doing it? And what good is a right to life if you can't live with dignity? They saw that Parliament hadn't acted, and they decided it was their duty to step into that void, to fill what they literally called a legislative vacuum.
So now we get to Section 4, the landmark Vishaka Guidelines. And this is where things get really incredible. In this stunning move, what we call judicial activism, the Supreme Court of India did something totally extraordinary. Since there was no law, they basically created one themselves.
So what did that look like? Well, for the first time, The very first time in Indian law, the term sexual harassment got a clear, concrete definition. And this was huge. It wasn't just about physical assault. It covered a whole range of unwelcome behavior: physical contact, asking for sexual favors, making sleazy remarks, showing pornography, basically any unwelcome conduct, physical, verbal, or even nonverbal, that was sexual in nature. It took this vague idea of being harassed and made it something you could actually take to court. But they didn't just define the problem, which is key. They also created a solution. And they put the responsibility right where it belonged, on the employer. From now on, it was the company's job to prevent harassment. It was their job to create a proper complaints committee. It was their job to make sure all female employees knew their rights. And get this, they even had to help an employee if the harasser was a third party, like a client or a customer.
And they got really specific about how this complaints committee had to work. It couldn't just be anyone. It had to be led by a woman. At least half the members had to be women. And this is so important, it had to have a third-party member, someone from an NGO, for example. Why? To make sure there was no internal pressure on the committee to sweep things under the rug. It was all about making it fair and impartial.
Okay, last section. Section 5. From guidelines to law. Because we have to be really clear about this, these guidelines weren't just, some friendly suggestions. They became the actual law of the land, kicking off a whole new chapter in workplace safety.
Think about this number: 16 years. For 16 long years, these guidelines from the Supreme Court were the law on workplace sexual harassment in India. That was the rulebook everyone had to follow, while the country was basically waiting for Parliament to catch up and write an official law.
And make no mistake, these guidelines had real power. There's this part of the Constitution, Article 141, that basically says a Supreme Court ruling is the law until Parliament makes a new one. So the Vishaka Guidelines weren't just good advice. They were a legally binding order that every single employer, whether government or private, had to obey.
You can draw a straight line from this court case to the law we have today. The legacy is just undeniable. Those 1997 Vishaka Guidelines, they laid the entire groundwork for the law that would eventually be passed in 2013, the Sexual Harassment of Women at Workplace Act, which you might know as the POSH Act. Yeah, it took another 16 years for Parliament to finally get it done, but when they did, that new law was built directly on the principles the Supreme Court had established all those years ago.
So when you look at the whole story, it's just this incredible example of how one person's fight, Banwari Devi's fight, with the help of the Vishaka Collective, could trigger a nationwide legal revolution. This case created the rulebook. It gave women the legal tools to fight back. But that brings us to the big lingering question, doesn't it? A landmark ruling, a new law, that can change the rules. But what does it really take to change the culture?